Okay, so I'm just going to introduce myself first. My name is Dr. Susan Swim. I'm the Executive Director of Now I See a Person Institute. Now I See a Person Institute is a nonprofit devoted to helping people who have not succeeded in traditional treatments, whether therapies or medications or hospitalization. For for decades, we've been working with people in ways that do not involve coercion or telling people that they have an incurable diagnosis that they can't get over. And we've had people for 40 years be able to have complete recovery. And I'm going to introduce them just below me right now. And this is Ashley, and Ashley's on faculty at Now I See a Person Institute. She's one of our recovery consultants and very integral to our team. And then to the left of me, I have Mr. Rick Fee, and he is going to be sharing his story about some of the cases, unfortunately, that we aren't able to help, or that or these particular situations that we want people to know more about, because it's a very dangerous situation that people fall into when they enter the mental health field. And for a long time, I don't think I was this bold or this brave to be able to say these things. But the more and more that we would see people coming in to see us, you would hear really terrifying stories about treatment and about where they almost lost their lives, their family members, and themselves. I was having a conversation last week with a wonderful person in the field of um, addictions. And, you know, she was also talking about how, whether it's emotional issues that someone is having or mental, or, things like possibly psychosis, or even, using too many substances, or in some way or another, that people no longer are seen as people, but they're seen as entities. So you do have an addiction, you have a mental health diagnosis, you have an addiction and a mental health diagnosis, and you're told that you're never going to be able to get well. So unlike before, like the 80s, when people weren't told these types of things, everyone had an ability to heal. There wasn't a huge amount of finances attached to being a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or a therapist. In fact, when I was a young clinician, you had almost, no private hospitals. And so I'm one of those dinosaurs that was able to see this field grow from being able to temporarily help people that were suffering into kind of this massive social construction of treatment where people cannot be free and they cannot get out of treatment. So, Mr. Fee, I was wondering if maybe you could um, talk with us a little bit about your journey through what I was talking about previously. I know that we've talked about this before, but there's so much of it that I don't know. And I just really appreciate you coming today, because I think your voice will help save other people's lives, at least give people options. So thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to Ashley, and please call me Rick, not Mr. Fee. Um, the story is actually the story of my son Richard and his entry into the whole psychiatry industry, I'll call it, was one of Adderall is kind of viewed as the study drug. Growing up, Richard never had issues in school, never had problems with teachers, with other students. There were other kids, friends of his, that were on Ritalin. Now, this is going into early 90s, mid 90s, when he was in grade school. But he never had any of those issues. But it is common knowledge on high school campuses and universities and colleges that Adderall and those type of drugs will give you an acute focus for a short period of time. That's why you get the nickname the study drug. And these drugs are passed around from friends who have prescriptions to some of their other friends that don't have ADHD, don't have a diagnosis, and don't have a prescription. It's like one of those things where, I've got exams coming up. I need to study all night. Can I get an Adderall from you? And these kids just share it back and forth. They don't know the consequences of it. They're not told that they're basically taking a narcotic that is highly addictive, dangerous, and the molecular structure of Adderall is very close to a methamphetamine. That's illegal. But these kids don't know this. And so that's how Richard was exposed to Adderall at first. Whether he took it in high school, I have no idea. I mean, he was an athlete, multiple sports, honor student, was looking at numerous colleges and universities to continue his education, and had many, many opportunities. And he chose a small school in North Carolina that he just kind of fell in love with, that small school feel. And one day, I think it was his freshman, sophomore year, he had mentioned to me that he had gotten an Adderall from one of his uh, teammates. He played baseball in college. He was a 4-year athlete during his college years. And he got an Adderall from his teammate because he had exams coming up and they'd been on the road. They had a bunch of games, and time was really tight. It's very difficult for any college student, number one, but then when you add a sport into it, it's like having two full-time jobs. And so he had mentioned that to me, and we had the discussion right then and there that you're not prescribed this medication. This medication is not good for you. There is no way you should be taking it. You need to figure out and allocate your time a little bit better. And so we had this big, I wouldn't say argument, it was just a very big discussion about it. And it never came up again during his college years. And he went on, he graduated with honors, played baseball all 4 years, and had the regular stress and struggles of most college student and student athletes. And it was his last year, his senior year, when everybody's trying to figure out their path. Where are they going to go? What's next after graduation? And his path that he chose was he was going to join the military and go to officer school and then get into medical school through the Navy, is what he was talking about, because he wanted to become a doctor. He wanted to help people. And shortly after graduation, he stayed in North Carolina, did not come home to Virginia. We learned much later, after he had passed away, that he had gotten a prescription for, it was Vyvanse at the time, through a nurse practitioner in Greensboro at a psychiatrist's office. And he was studying for his medical boards to get into med school. And he didn't have that outlet to go back to a teammate, because that part of his life was over at that time, and all these kids went back home, and that particular individual was no longer around. So he figured out, he needed to have his own supply so he can stay up and study and really do good on his MCATs. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the intense focus that dissipates, that doesn't last very long. You need more and more of the drug to try and get back to that original focus that you had at first. And you just never recapture that. It's like any narcotic, you get that initial high, but you're always chasing that. He could never get that focus, and he had his own prescription and he was abusing it. And I need to jump ahead a bit, because at this point I still didn't know. that he was taking Adderall, that he even went to a doctor. And within 15, 30 minutes, they said, okay, you have ADHD. We're going to give you Vyvanse. So he was looking for something, and he accomplished that goal to get his own supply. And then it was about a year or so. This was 2008. He graduated from college. So about 2009-ish, things were just kind of the train on the rails was wobbling a little bit. You know, I could see some things that just weren't right. I'd go visit him, you know, every few weeks or so. He was still playing baseball, but in an adult league. So I'd go down and watch, spend weekends with him, and it just was a little off, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. I just thought it was from, you know, stress of having a job now, living on his own, trying to get into med school. And then he lost the job for whatever reason, got another one, lost that one. So I'm like, you know, things just aren't really going so well. And he moved back home. And then when he moved back home, that's when, you know, he started working with me at my shop. And that's when we found out that he was on Adderall. And the way I found out was I was trying to add him to our company's insurance policy. And my agent called me up and said, I can't write your insurance because your son is taking this prescription. And I'm like, what prescription are you talking about? And he told me. And that's when I found out that he had Adderall prescription. And then from that point on, everything about him was changing. You know, he was irritable, he was moody, he was just not himself. We had always had a great relationship with him growing up and all through his college years. And he was very confrontational, kind of distancing himself from some of his friends here back home in Virginia Beach, and just was not himself. And I called him out on it, and we had a very heated discussion about the Adderall once I found out about it. And it just escalated from there. He had gone.
Good question. How did you know? Because a lot of parents do not know what you knew about Adderall then. They they think Adderall, they think help for my child. So how did you know that this was not something you thought was your son would benefit from?
So we go back to the years that he was in elementary school, and there was a couple kids that Richard played with on the street, and my wife and I knew that at least one, maybe two of his friends were taking Ritalin. And we saw how these particular kids acted while they were on that Ritalin. I mean, they were all over the place. They were uncontrollable. Supposedly, I guess you give it to them to control them, but it makes kids totally uncontrollable. And I just knew from that point, I didn't know much about it then. All I knew is that my son didn't show these behaviors, and that these kids that we see every day, they're on these medications, and that isn't anything that my son needed. And I was always had that mindset that he didn't need that, didn't have any issues. He actually came home with a survey while he was in elementary school. Now, this area, the Tidewater Hampton Roads area is what they call it, the 5 cities around us, is one of the hotbeds then and still is for ADHD diagnosis and overprescribing of Adderall. One of the biggest hotspots in the country. I'm not sure if being a military town has a lot to do with that in the numbers, the huge numbers of kids that are diagnosed and medicated. Maybe. But he came home with this survey, and it was just your typical ADD type of survey. And we're going through this, we're filling out our part. It's like, no, answering all the questions. No, he doesn't do this, he doesn't do that. And that just reinforced to me that he's not one of these kids that needs this medication. and he was fourth grade, maybe fifth grade at that time. And the person that was doing that study, and this is a whole nother story, but years later, we became, and we still are, very good friends. And when I told her that Richard had taken her survey, she was shocked. And we had met her after Richard had died. And but like I said, that's a whole nother story. But that was what I knew about it then, and I knew that Richard didn't have
Right.
any of
Right.
those traits that would incline me to think, oh, he needs help. He was a very easygoing kid. He was very well liked. He had all kinds of friends that were either smart or athletes, or I mean, he had friends in all different of those social cliques, that you would have in school, whether it's elementary, middle school, or high school. He was just very well liked. So he didn't have difficulty at all growing up. Things came easy for him. His education came easy. Sports, he worked a little bit harder at that, but he excelled at that too. So he didn't show any signs of, hey, he needs to go talk to somebody, because we never had any issues.
But
So
also you didn't quite know what you know now. And so you didn't know what to
no.
like.
So while all this is going on, when I knew that he was taking the Adderall, yeah, that I knew that he didn't need it. I knew it was changing him. I knew that he wasn't the same person on it. And I confronted the psychiatrist that had given it to him in Virginia Beach, because my son wasn't my son anymore. He was a totally different person. There was physical altercations, a lot of verbal abuse. And I went to this doctor's office unannounced and demanded to see him. He wouldn't talk to me. He stayed behind his little glass partition back where the receptionist was. And he told me, he says, I can't talk to you. My son's obviously at this point over 18, an adult. He says, I can't talk to you. Your son's an adult. You know, if I came out and talked to you, I could be sued. So he's more worried about himself being sued rather than helping me with my son and the issues. And it was wintertime. It was New Year's Eve, actually. And I told him as I was leaving, because he was going to call the police on me. And I told him as I was leaving, he had a room full of patients in the waiting room. This is a pretty big psychiatry practice. There were, if I remember correctly, there was 10 or 11 psychiatrists in this practice and numerous therapists. So the waiting room was full. And I said to him, for anybody that could hear, and I wasn't quiet about what I said, you keep giving my son Adderall, you're going to kill him. And I left. And this was a good year and a half before Richard actually took his own life. And it's those things. If I knew then what I know now, could things have been different? But we did the best we could with the information and the knowledge that we had. At that point, we still look to these particular doctors as, why are you not trying to help him? Listen to me, listen to what I'm telling you about him. Help me so this doesn't get worse. We went to a family therapist. We got Richard to agree to go to a family therapist outside of his psychiatrist. And that's kind of when the labels started popping up. He'd already been diagnosed ADHD after 45 minutes to an hour with this psychiatrist that I confronted. And then our therapist, after a session or two that Richard showed up for, he wouldn't go to anymore after that. He was saying, well, he's probably schizophrenic, bipolar. along with his ADHD. So just lumping all these different diagnoses and these labels on him. And I'm like, he's none of that. He isn't any of those things. It's the medication that's doing that. And I stood my ground on that. And I was right about that. But his psychiatrist wouldn't listen. Our therapist disagreed with me on that. And his explanation was, the human brain still is developing up till 25, which is true. So why are you giving these highly potent and addictive narcotics to these kids with brains that are still developing, especially starting at young ages? I said, so he's on this medication. You're saying his brain's still developing up until 25. Let's get him off of these things. Oh, well, we can't do that. It was everywhere we turn and everybody we went to try and get help that should have offered some sort of help to Richard. Everywhere it all broke down. And are there things I wish I had done differently? Obviously, because of the outcome, but living it during that time, I felt from the very first confrontation with that initial psychiatrist that I was in a fight for his life, for my son's life at that point, because this guy didn't even want to listen to me. And that was the first of numerous confrontations with this particular doctor. And he wouldn't, at any one time, he would just not listen. Richard would tell, and at this point now he's becoming fully addicted. The thing about going to med school, that's out of the window at this point. He's fully addicted on these drugs. He tells his psychiatrist, I lost my prescription, or my dad took away my prescription, which was never the case. And he would just write him another one, which is highly illegal to do that anyway, but he did it. So to me, this particular doctor, and there were a couple in the mix as this progressed. To me, he was just a drug pusher with a white coat and a fancy diploma on his wall. That's all he was. Each one of Richard's appointments with him, the med checks, lasted 5 to 7 minutes. Documented. And a lot of this information, my wife and I didn't even know until 2 years after Richard died, when we requested all of his records. We were talking to a reporter from the New York Times, and he wanted to look at all of Richard's medical records. So we had gone and gotten them from each of the doctors that he had spent time with, and we were shocked at what those records told us that we never knew. And if I knew some of those things in there, it was just the amount of the prescriptions, the numerous times that in the notes would be, patient came in, said his father took his Adderall. Patient came in, said he lost his Adderall. I gave him another prescription. Just those types of things. We had no clue. And the dosages were just creeping up and getting higher and higher. And you could see that progression in the records. And at that point, it made total sense to me, because as we went from 2009, when he came home, through the last part of that year and into 2010, he progressively got worse and worse with the addiction, and his mood swings, and his physical body was changing. I mean, he was a big kid. He was 6'2", 6'3", well over 200 pounds, muscle, just athletic build, to where he had lost 40 some pounds, extremely lightweight. Towards the end there, he started breaking out. He thought it was acne. But basically what it was were the scabs from the amphetamines running through his body. It looked like a meth addict that gets the scabs and they're scratching them, and they, because he had them on his back and things like that. And he thought it was acne, and we figured out that that's not what that was. And at one point, his dosage for Adderall with the second doctor was 90 milligrams a day. That is a huge amount, well above what's recommended. Last time I looked at that, I think the recommended dosage for adults is around 25, 35 milligrams per day. And this particular doctor said, well, it was the Adderall XR, the extended release. Take some in the morning and then take it again at night. And it's like, why at night? When Richard would take so much of this, he would be up for 3 and 4 days at a time because his body is just racing on the speed, this amphetamine. And then he would crash for 3 or 4 days and be in his room with the door closed, and we would hardly see him.
Did you know at that point in time that it was speed? Or did you still think it was some type of?
Well, I knew that Adderall was an amphetamine, and that speed was an amphetamine, and I didn't know at that time how close Adderall was molecularly in structure to methamphetamine. I didn't know that then. It was much after the fact with some other people that we did some interviews with, and things that kind of broke that down extremely well when I realized what it actually is. Yeah, it was crazy the amount that he was being prescribed, and he would not overdose, but he would not take it as prescribed. And he got with the first doctor, it got to such a point with the first doctor that I finally convinced the doctor to give us a family meeting where Richard and myself and the doctor sat in his office. And I'm like, oh, good. I'm finally getting in front of this guy. I can have him there with my son, and we can come to some resolution to this, some way to figure this out. That didn't work out that way. Not even close. We're in this meeting, this appointment, and he looks at me, and this psychiatrist tells me, I know your son better than you do. And I'm like, how's that possible? You've met with him for 45 minutes on your initial appointment, if that. I knew that at that time, or I just assumed it. I said, but you see him once a month, and that's it. How do you know him better than I do? There's no possible way. So that didn't go very well. And it kind of came down to the point in that meeting. I said, well, so here's the choice. You keep giving my son Adderall, he's not going to be able to live at my house. Because at this point, my wife and I are also kind of concerned for our own safety.
Right.
Because we don't know what he's going to do. I mean, we're going to bed at night, locking our door, because we don't know if he's going to come in and just go into a rage. I said, we can't live like this. If you're going to continue to prescribe him Adderall, he's got to go elsewhere. He's got to live someplace else. And then the doctor said, he looked at Richard, he said, look, I said, I can't be the reason why you're going to be homeless. So I'm going to discontinue your Adderall. I'm going to give you something else instead. So I'm thinking this might be a glimmer of hope here. What he prescribed, if I remember correctly, was Abilify and Seroquel. Took him off the Adderall, gave him those other two, if I remember that correctly.
Did he take him off cold turkey, or did he
No,
lower it?
he just stopped. he just stopped giving him Adderall. So yeah, it was just cut off. That one thing right there, so I'm glad you asked that. That one thing right there is the biggest thing that I did not know while Richard was alive that I wish I did. You cannot go cold turkey off this. You have got to wean yourself off of it. And I didn't know it at that particular time. I'm like, good, the Adderall's out. Now I got to deal with this other stuff I don't know anything about or had never heard of it before. But we'll figure that out. Well, needless to say, Richard was not happy about that at all. We go back to the house. He got home before I did. He tried to run me over with his car in the doctor's parking lot
Because he was so angry at the Adderall
because
being.
he was so angry. Yeah. Yeah. And we live right across the street. This practice was right outside our neighborhood. So Richard gets home before me. I get home and he's taking a baseball bat to pretty much anything he can take a baseball bat to. And he's threatening to burn down the house and he's doing all this other stuff, just this crazy behavior. And yeah, that was kind of that was a really rough time, but I was also had a little bit of hope because the Adderall was out of the picture at that time. Well, Richard, with this, he didn't like the Abilify or the Seroquel. He said it made him feel weird. He didn't get the same feeling off of that as he did the Adderall that he was abusing. So he didn't stay on those very long. He just took himself off of those. And then he
Did
went,
the doctor at that point in time, was the doctor aware that he was prescribing him over, did he ever mention that he was prescribing him more than was called for, or that he was adding prescriptions? He never.
no, he never told me that he was doing that. He never told me that he gave him a prescription before his other one ran out because Richard claimed he either lost it or I took it, which was never the case. The doctor never told me that. That's what we found out when we got Richard's medical records after he died.
So what did the doctor say that he was treating him for? What was the
ADHD. He was treating him for ADHD, is what he labeled him with. It was our therapist that added those other two as potentials. And during that, go
were they
ahead.
in the same office? They in the same office, the
No, 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 no,
therapist and.
no, no, no.
Mhm.
The family therapist that we were going to was somebody that my wife found that was not associated with this practice whatsoever.
Okay.
And my wife and I continued to see him even after Richard decided not to. And then my wife and I continued to go see this particular family therapist for a number of years after Richard died until he retired.
Mm.
Nice man. I think he learned a few things too in this process. Because I stuck to my guns about the medication making all these changes, that it wasn't Richard's brain itself. It was how Richard's brain was reacting to the medication. And, after that, the first psychiatrist took him off the Adderall. Richard decided, well, I don't want to be here in Virginia Beach anymore. I'm going to go back to North Carolina. I'm going to try and find a job because he loved North Carolina. He had good friends there. It was a nice area where he was living. And he's like, I want to go back there and I want to stay with one of my friends and find a job. I'm like, fine, I'll support that 100%. Let's do that. Let's get that figured out. So he went down there And then he came back. That didn't work out as well as he had thought. He came back about a month or so later. I might be off on the time on that a little bit, but he came back and he seemed like he was getting close to his self, like his brain was, for lack of a better description, to me, it seemed like his brain was kind of detoxing from the Adderall a little bit. And I had glimpses of what he used to be like. His personality was coming back. And I really liked that. But then I'd say after a week or so, 2 weeks maybe, things started getting off the rails a little bit again. And I'm like, man. So I asked my wife, I said, call your insurance company and see if any prescriptions have been filled on your insurance. And lo and behold, Richard came back to that same psychiatrist who took him off the Adderall. And now he hasn't been seeing this guy for at least a month or two at this point. He comes back and he says, look, I went to North Carolina. I have a job that I really like, which he didn't. I have a job I really like, and I really need to focus on my job. Can I get my Adderall prescription? Oh, sure. No questions asked. Boom, boom, boom. There's your Adderall prescription again. Didn't call to verify anything. Didn't even check with me, but my son's over 18, so that was his excuse as to why not. He could have cared less about my son. So he gave him Adderall again. And it's like, man, I mean, he's another opportunity to help him or to turn him around was gone. And we're back to worse than square one. And it was
Were,
just cycle like that.
were you surprised at all the voicelessness that you had with these doctors, where your voice didn't hold legitimacy?
I would say I was more frustrated and angry. I was fully aware, being that he was an adult, that my influence over his medical records, his medical care is limited because he was an adult. But I'm just trying to implore this person, this, from one man to another, help me, help my son. And he wouldn't, he didn't care. So it was frustration, it was anger. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I did not expect the blowback that I got, because basically I questioned that doctor. I said, what makes you think you know my son better than me? How can you sit there and say that? And I questioned, how did you diagnose him? How did you come up with this ADHD diagnosis? Well, we were sitting here talking and he was looking out the window, and I was like, that's it? You give my son this diagnosis and this medication that's ruining his life, and he was looking out the window? I didn't want to look at him either. I wanted to look out the window too. But I think more frustrating and anger with that. But my whole contention then and still, if you can have adult children on a family insurance policy to the age of 26, then there should be some parental consent, or parents should have some knowledge as to what's going on, especially and more importantly, in a life and death situation. They should be involved in that in some way in those situations. Do I need to know, or does a parent need to know every time an adult child goes in for a checkup, this, that, or the other? No, but when there's something serious, parents should know. I still feel that. I've tried to get that HIPAA law changed And that that's a whole nother frustrating thing right there. I think in many cases, parents are even helpless with their minor kids in some medical situations now with the way things have progressed over the last few years, which is even more sad. So, parents trying to do the best thing for their kids, and they're just all these roadblocks, and they don't care. It's all about the money. It's all about how can I book more patients? How can I maximize my profits? And like I said earlier, it's there's more money in the treatment than there is in a cure. And I had a friend of mine describe this to me because it didn't always used to be like this. Psychiatry back in the day, and you would probably, well, I don't want to influence what I think you should think on this, but back in the day, psychiatry was a lot of talk, a lot of conversation with the patient and the doctor. And then psychiatry changed. Psychiatry became, well, we're going to prescribe medicine. We need to be relevant. We need to have an income stream. So we're going to prescribe medicine. Somebody else can talk to these people. We're not going to do it. I mean, it just,
You see more people for med checks than,
yes,
than, than talking to them.
exactly. So the insurance companies will give a doctor X amount of dollars per 15-minute med check.
You know how much it is?
The number that I was told at the time, this was 2010. I think it was like 90 to $100 at that time. I could be a little bit off, and I think different regions are different. But particular insurance company would say on average, just use $100 for a 15-minute med check. So
Well,
that's $400. But when the med check appointments last only 5 to 7 minutes, now your $400 has now become double that. You're now making $800 an hour, just cycling these kids in and out. And then you're also selling these prescriptions that in some shape or form, they're getting kickbacks, even though that's illegal, but they're getting kickbacks. We found that out. And
how, ask you what kind of kickbacks, because, I think that, I have my own ideas about this, but I think it's important for people that might be hearing this to know what you're talking about.
so legally, doctors cannot take money directly from the pharmaceutical companies to prescribe a drug. It can't be that plain and simple. However, doctors can get an all expense paid trip to a conference to talk about a medication and then get paid a lot of money for it. So when I say kickbacks, it's kind of done in that roundabout way. And we learned all this after the fact, after Richard had died. And it's the influence of the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies on the practice of medicine has absolutely ruined it in so many ways. It's not about the patient's health, physically or mentally. It's all about turning profits. And they don't really care how many people get hurt or get cast away as they're going through. They just, that blows my mind. And I think that has actually gotten a lot worse over the past 5-10 years. Especially the mental health is definitely a lot worse in the past 5 years going to the COVID stuff. But it's such a battle to be able to fight for your kids no matter what age they are now.
Because I don't know how it is in Virginia Beach, but where I live is that if the parents do not, okay, let's just say that the teacher, well, I'm just going to go back a little bit and then we'll we'll merge these stories a little bit. When I was a young clinician, there was no ADHD, right? So
Yep.
there's and then all of a sudden that comes through. And what happens is that the clinicians start to be trained that they know better than you, right? They know better than the parents. They know what's best for those children, that they might be being seen for brief, brief periods of time, and that children are all being treated the same way. So it's like one size shoe fits all children. And you start having this diagnostic criteria. So when you said a survey, I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, like even if your son didn't pass the survey, it wouldn't have mattered. A survey cannot indicate what's happening with somebody. There's too many uncontrolled variables. What if on the day that that survey happened, your child had a fight with the teacher or bullied or was embarrassed or there's just so many different things that are going on than to say, okay, well, let's mark these boxes and then that says that this child has ADHD. There's no biology. You know, as much as they tell the children, this is like, oh, take medication for like your dad does for heart medication. There's nothing there. When we first found out about this, when I can remember I was working at a clinic where we really tried to help people without medication or hospitalization. I remember there was like four of us sitting around a table. And when we heard that kids were going to be put on speed, we looked at each other and we said, there's no way the parents are going to do this. Because we just come off the culture of the 70s, right? So you had like Black Mollies and this and that. And, especially, I was a nurse before I was a clinician. So you go to nursing school, everybody's taking speed, right? Like if not, everybody should have fed. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden, you see that this is given to children and it doesn't stop. It just continues. And the same types of things that you see for your son happens to the little children. So you have little children that are far worse off after being treated than before being treated. But this goes back to the education. So the textbooks changed, right? So the textbooks changed, and it changed that, that you have teachers that are being like junior psychiatrists that are seeing these children in the schools and then saying they need to be on something, and that goes before the administrative team, and the administrative team can actually report parents. They can report parents for not doing something, and they can, if the children are put on medications by a physician or someone, nurse practitioners now, or other types of clinicians that can prescribe medication. If they do not take the medication, the child can be taken away from the parents. You know that, right?
I have heard that, yes, and that is absolutely horrible. Absolutely horrible.
So the kids are put into foster care. The kids are told that their parents basically don't love them enough, right? Because if that's the reason why they're being taken away, then there's something that your parents are being so neglectful that they don't want to see you on the medication, that everybody else in the world thinks that the medication is something. There's no informed consent, right? There's no consent knowing the adverse effects of these medications.
That's a whole nother dark agenda right there for control and getting control of the kids and taking it away from the parents that goes beyond anything that we probably even want to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is just absolutely horrible that's going that it's not like that here in Virginia that I'm aware of. I've
Mm-hmm.
not heard that. But the teachers in our area were very instrumental in those early years of getting kids diagnosed and being put on the on the Adderall and the Ritalin, because teachers were getting 25, 30, 35 kids in a classroom, and it was the boys that were always acting up, and it was a way to control the boys. Your boys are kind of obnoxious, you need to put them on this medication. And then the
Right.
parents would, okay, we'll go to a doctor. And when I was growing up, you looked at your doctor and you were told your doctor is almost godlike. Doctor would never do anything that's wrong. And that was one thing that Richard kept telling me when we would have our confrontations about the Adderall and what it was doing. He said, well, a doctor would never give me anything that was bad for me. I'm like, well, in this particular case, this is not good for you. This is bad.
Right.
I think
But
that there's, sorry,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think that there's something really interesting to be said about the power dynamic between people and their doctors, because they have this big fancy degree and they make all this money and they look like they have their life together. It puts them in this really interesting role where um, it makes the person feel a little bit less than, and especially when someone's in their adolescence or early adult years, you kind of just trust them, right? It's kind of like if your grandparent was like, "Oh, I went through that when I was younger." You have this innate sense of trust because they got their degree. They studied this for years. They do this all day, every day. So there's this innate trust. It's not just a drug dealer on the street, but what is actually happening is the same thing that's happening on the street, which is horrible. And the fact that it's happening to teens is even worse. And like when I was a young adult, they did this as well, where they started prescribing like a lot of really, really heavy medications. And then I can see this within my peers and like my generation in general. There's this cultural acceptance of, oh, it's okay because the doctor's doing it. But the second if it's off the street, it's like a whole other demon, right? Like this is a horrible thing that's going on around the country, and I'm sorry that it went so far with your son. And thank you for being strong enough to share your voice, because this isn't something that people talk about. So thank you for sharing your voice and bringing an awareness to this culture about how deeply impactful these medications are, because we there's this like almost this like click that goes on within um, my generation. I'm 25, right? I've been in academia for a while, and like in my high school, it's like in college, you see this all the time where people are talking about these medications, and they like you said before, how like it's common for people to trade them or do other things because they're unfortunately kids, and there's a lot of pressure from school, and because it's given by a doctor and it has a label with your name on it, it makes it feel okay, but it's not okay.
Exactly right. That is the exact same argument I've been stating for a number of years now. You're 100% on that one. I agree with that. I was speaking at a conference in Reno, Nevada, back in September, um, at the University of Nevada at Reno, and in the audience was a bunch of faculty, psychiatrists, therapists, psychologists, and students, and giving them the kind of rundown on what happened with Richard. And I basically, I closed by telling them, I said, if you are going to a doctor and your doctor's not discussing with you your stress levels, what kind of exercise you get, what's your diet like, what's your work-life balance, if your doctor's not discussing these types of things with you before prescribing you narcotics, you don't have a doctor. You've got a drug pusher with a white coat and a fancy diploma. And that hit home for especially the psychiatry students in the audience, because a few of them came up and spoke to me afterwards. And it's, I mean, something has to happen. Something really has to happen to where, I mean, it all comes down to informed consent. Just like you said, Susan, informed consent. It has to be there. And with Richard's situation, he had another time. He came to me after I found out about he went back to the doctor and got the Adderall again. He came back to me a month or two later, and he, with a straight face and all of his mental faculties, he says, "Dad, something's not right. I need help." And this is after months of me saying, "I got to get you help. We got to try something else." He finally came to me and said, "I need help." At the time, I was instructed the best way to get him help is to take him to the emergency room. They will evaluate him. They will get him into a rehab type situation, which is what I wanted. Another opportunity to get him off this Adderall. And he was all gung ho about it. The emergency room took hours, 3, 4, 5 hours of waiting. And in the meantime, he's getting antsy, irritated, angry, wanted me to leave. My wife was there with us. He has seen the psychiatric hospital, which was right next door, sent over a representative to speak to him for a few minutes and said, "Okay, we don't have anywhere to put him in a rehab. We're going to refer you to," and they call this the rapid response team. "We have a psychiatrist that deals specifically with Adderall addiction. We're going to refer you there for the help that you're trying to get." This is psychiatrist number 2. So it was, I think within a week, Richard had that appointment with the therapist in that particular practice and with that psychiatrist. Totally different practice than where he was at first. And the person he was sent to, that was an addiction specialist supposed to get him off the Adderall, gave him a prescription for Adderall. He left with Adderall prescription. And there's another situation where there was somebody else, another situation that could have helped him, that could have saved him, but it didn't. And that Adderall prescription, and over the time period of this particular doctor seeing him, which was only for a few months, put Richard in a full-blown Adderall-induced psychosis with the abuse, to where he was eventually taken by the police after a major incident at our house for a 1-week stay in the psychiatric hospital. It was absolutely horrible. So now he's in the psychiatric hospital, and I'm hoping, all right, he's here. They're not giving him Adderall. Maybe we have another chance, because all the other chances got blown up. Maybe we have another chance. And he gets released out of there after 5 days. No follow-up, no nothing. And to make a really long story short, within a few months, he goes back to the first psychiatrist. First psychiatrist gave him a 3-month prescription for Adderall. And he hasn't seen this first psychiatrist in probably like 3 to 5 months. So he doesn't say to Richard, "Hey, where have you been? I haven't seen you. What's going on? What are you doing?" It's like, "Nope, here's your prescription for this month, and here's 2 more for the next couple months afterwards." And then that was the end. That was the end right there. That's what put Richard over the edge. And it was another one of those situations where we thought we were getting him back. And then one day he was just kind of out there again. And my wife checked her insurance policy and found out he got a prescription from this first doctor. And I called him up and I let him have it. Told him what had transpired. And he kicked Richard to the curb. He says, "Well, I'm not seeing him anymore because you're going to end up suing me. I'm not going to see him anymore." So I'll back up just slightly. The second doctor that was supposed to be the rapid response team addiction specialist, as soon as he found out about the week-long stay in the psychiatric hospital, he dropped Richard. He says, "I'm not seeing you anymore." Richard had become bad business for him, I guess, at that point. So the other doctor, when I confronted him, he's like, well, you're going to end up suing me. So I'm not going to, I can't see your son anymore. And then Richard ended up running out of his prescription. And, you know, that's one of those things that I did not know. You can't go wild turkey. He just didn't have any left. And he ended up hanging himself. And so the tragedy of this whole thing is you look back at what happened to Richard any number of times, there could have been an intervention. Somebody could have stepped up and helped him. I mean, to me, it's clear as day, all the different times where somebody could have done something different if I had known something different. But all these people, these doctors that we are told to just basically bow at their feet and say, yes, you know, you're perfect, you know everything. They didn't help him. They did the exact opposite. So that's the real tragedy about it. Now, what's come out of it is during that time where Richard told me that, you know, something was wrong and he needed help. He said that, you know, also that medical school wasn't a thing for him. He wanted to still help people, but he wanted to do it in a different way. He wanted to write books and speak and talk to people about whatever it was to help them instead of being a doctor. So what's happened since his death in this tragic situation is just this. We're sitting here, we're talking about it. And there have been numerous books, there's been documentaries, there's been interviews, TV appearances, speaking things, all telling what happened to Richard. Either somebody telling it after we've told it to them, or like three of us are sitting here talking about it. So this is still Richard's way of getting word out and trying to help people. So while it's extremely hard to do, I do appreciate the opportunity. And the hope is that this will click a bulb in somebody's head to either help somebody or to seek help or to try a different path to get to where they need to be, rather than go down the same road that Richard did.
You know, I have one child and I'm so sorry for your loss because, but if someone had tried to put my daughter on medication, I would have taken her out, like people don't know any better. I mean, by talking with you, they're going to have some ideas. But as you guys both addressed, that we think that people have it for us, that if we can't trust the people that we're paying to take care of us, who can we trust?
Exactly.
And this is not an isolated story, and this is a story in so many different avenues. I'm gonna just kind of extend this, but we have people that are going to Canada to kill themselves over an ADHD diagnosis. I don't know if you're aware of that, Rick, but
Oh yeah, I know that that's going on. Yes.
Mhm. Over an ADHD diagnosis. And in the country that Ashley's in right now, you cannot get that medication. Is that correct, Ashley? Like, you can't get it. They don't give it. So go ahead, Ashley, you go.
Oh, I was just confirming that in Germany it is very difficult to get Adderall.
Or Italy.
Oh, Italy, it's very, very difficult. There's much more reliance on your friend group, and talk therapy is much more common than psychiatry.
Mhm. Mhm.
but also Europe has a totally different, like the healthcare system is not private, it's publicly funded, and also they don't make money off of prescriptions, and a lot of like ER situations are volunteers. So it's totally a different system.
Yeah,
Denmark's having a big issue with Adderall right now. My wife and I have spoken to a film producer from Denmark who's come over here numerous times and is doing a documentary on it. So I know Denmark is having issues. And it's just that whole region, that area is another area for the pharmaceutical companies to conquest to make their profits. I mean, when ADHD diagnosis first came out, it was, oh, it's only younger children, ages 7 to 13, mostly boys, and they'll outgrow it. Well, then they've medicated a major percentage of those kids. Then the goalpost changed. Then it became young adults in that are now ADHD. They need the medication. They kept going over. I had a friend who was in his mid 60s. This goes back about 10 or 15 years. Went to see the exact same psychiatrist that my son saw, first one. He was told within 10 minutes he was ADHD. At mid 60s, put him on Adderall. He stayed on it for a month and said, no, I can't do this. So they moved the goalposts. Where can we go next? What age group can we exploit? How can we change the diagnosis to where, oh, now these people need it? How can we change the wording of it? There was one that really blew me away: work displacement disorder for people that work late night shifts. They were getting Adderall. Did either one of y'all see the article in the New York Times early April?
Mhm.
So there was an article written in the New York Times, and it was, have we been thinking about ADHD all wrong, was the title. And it basically boiled down to that these doctors in this article said that there's no biological basis for an ADHD diagnosis. And these are the same ones that years ago said that there was a chemical imbalance in the brain, saying it for years and for decades, and prescribing this medication. Now they're the exact same ones are saying there's no biological basis.
Exactly.
It's just,
Exactly.
I think it was the first week of April that came out. It's an interesting read, to go back and look at that. But and they even said in the article that the doctors really didn't know how this medication worked. Well, if you don't know, why are you prescribing it? To the
Because,
detriment of almost everybody that's taken it.
right. Well, I would say it's a detriment to everybody that's taken it, not almost everybody that's taken it.
No, yes, you are correct. Yes, I misspoke there, but yes, everybody. I would
Drugs
agree.
are drugs, right? So you
Yes.
could, I think it was one of Ashley's family members a long time ago made a lot of comparisons between, they're a pharmacist, is that correct, Ashley? And they're making a lot of comparisons about these drugs. Do you want to talk about that just for a second?
Um, can you jog my memory a little bit? Because I have family members that work in the field of
Well,
like psychiatry, pharmacy, and all of them.
what I remember is that at one point in time, they were telling your mother that all these drugs that your generation was taking had a sister drug that was in the streets.
Yeah, yeah, that was my cousin. Yeah, so she's a pharmacist and has worked as a like like within pharmacy for like over like a decade now. It's been a very long time. Um, and she has her degree in it and everything, but she would see like based off of that they all have sister drugs within the streets. So Adderall and methamphetamine are essentially chemically the same thing. And also she would talk about how within pharmacy she would see how people would abuse it and then come back to her, and yeah, it's a very sick thing that's happening right now. It's very tragic to see, and it's horrible to see this impact on our youth. Um, because when you give kids medication at a really young age, they don't know how to approach the world without medication and without substance. So then you then create a generation of people that don't know how to deal with their emotions, and it makes it really hard for them to navigate the real world because they didn't go through that phase of like, oh, something's hard, let me try a different approach. Let me learn how to, like, oh, I'm stressed, let me go exercise. They don't go through that. They go, oh, I need a pill. And then if they can't get it from a psychiatrist, then they can get it from the street, which is horrible.
That only if you have the right pill, then you're gonna be able to have the right life. Because we're telling people that. You know,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many young children I've talked to that they say they have a broken brain. They can't study. You know, like, and I tell these stories of, when my daughter was young, there were children there that were adopted from different countries, and maybe it was Korea, right, or China, and there was no running water. There was no education, there was no literacy. And you have these parents and they scoop them up, these adopted parents, and they give them violin lessons and all these type of wonderful extracurricular activities. And these children are the honor students of their classes. Those were the stories we used to have. Now the stories are much different because of the broken biology. That is, these children come from, places where, the parents, you know, probably had addictions or something like that. And, it's even changed the face of how children are adopted. By the time that children are adopted and people find out about, their histories, the children are given their histories to look at. And so it might say that my parents are addicts. Well, then they're going to be addicts too, even if they didn't live with it. I mean, like, it's just, it goes on and on. There's so many, the tendrils are so many different directions. But what I want to do out of these types of meetings is give people hope that there's alternatives. I mean, you've got to understand, we're an organization that we've seen, I don't know, thousands of children for ADHD or for our diagnosis of ADHD and never medicated. And and I want people to be able to realize that there is just different choices. If they want to go down these other routes, then those are certainly things that they can consider. But these aren't benign. None of these are benign. The first time that they're put on medications, there is a consequence that parents are not being told about.
Well, I think also, I was talking to an emergency room doctor, I'd say after one of our events through our foundation about a year ago. And what he was describing to me is we have a generation of middle-aged parents and younger parents that grew up with labels and being on medication. And now their kids have labels and are on medication. And he was saying that of the young kids that come into the emergency room, 4 out of 5 have multiple mental diagnoses. And he said it's to the point to where if a kid has a group of friends and does not have a diagnosis, they feel left out because all their other friends have diagnoses. I
Yeah.
mean, what a strange turn of events that is. I mean, I think what we really need to to get to. And I love the fact that you haven't medicated anybody, that you treat ADHD with no medication. We need to get to a point where we have competent doctors that can deprescribe, and areas where people with these issues have more access to talk therapy than pharmaceutical therapy.
Mhm.
And our foundation, the Richard Fee Foundation, we get calls and emails and letters all the time of somebody calling on behalf of a family member. I was just speaking to a gentleman yesterday who has a brother that is going through very similar situations that Richard's gone through, and he needs help in finding some place where he can take his brother so he can get him off the medications.
Right.
And in our area, it's very limited. I mean, I know of maybe one or two, but they're out of state. And I mean, if you guys have any ideas, let me know, because we get inquiries about this all the time. And these people are looking for help, but they can't get it. Where they turn, they just get turned right back into the pill mills and keep getting different medications. It's
So actually, we can talk about that. We're forming a group of practitioners together with, along with not just the psychologists, but the psychiatrists and the nurse practitioners, for them to be able to taper people off of medications and prevent them from the ones that aren't on medications of going on them. And because I tell you, when I have children that are coming in on medications to see us, I'm more frightened of them than the children that aren't, because they can so easily take a handful of those medications.
yeah,
I'm not, it's the suicide rate is so high. And unfortunately, one of the things I really want to accentuate before we wrap up is that if you don't feel like your doctor or your psychologist or your therapist or whoever is listening to you, then you need to call, right? Call. I don't know if you tried calling the boards or your insurance companies or whoever that might be. And because sometimes it's just, if you change and your records get changed to another person, that's going to be in the notes. And if you're fighting for your son like you did, probably you were given a diagnosis as well. Do you know that? I mean, like, in some way they try to vilify the parents for not going along with the treatment. And so, you know, in these types of cases, we have to really find some way, if it's not working in one direction, how can you work in other directions, that you find somebody that's able to listen to you? And that's what I feel awful about, is that you were imprisoned in a system which didn't give you much of a voice with your son whatsoever. HIPAA law or not HIPAA law, you
right,
know?
right. Now that was one area that we did try and go down. The first psychiatrist, he said, I can put on his record, on your son's record, to never give him Adderall, and it'll be in the state system. And then, so the trick that he played on me on this was, if I do that and your son has an emergency situation, a car accident, and he goes to the hospital, they will not give him medication to help him because this is already on his record. I'm like, how's that possible? He said, that's the way it works. He just didn't want that to go into the medical record, because then it would have drawn attention to him. Now, as a result of all of this that happened with these two particular doctors in Richard's case, and the New York Times article that was written about Richard back in 2013, which blew it all open, the Virginia State Medical Board brought up both doctors on charges.
Mhm.
We didn't solicit for charges. The state medical board saw the New York Times article, interviewed us, brought up charges. The first psychiatrist had his license taken away. And that resulted in that particular practice being shut down, and all those people just dispersed elsewhere because that was such bad publicity. It shut them down. The second psychiatrist, he basically got slap on the hands and had to do some extracurricular study. He was much more well spoken at the board hearing, so he kind of weaseled his way out of it. So there were some repercussions there that hopefully helped other people down the road, that they didn't have to see that one particular guy. But yeah, I having a group of practitioners that can taper, that is absolutely awesome. I think that is definitely needed everywhere. And I wish you much success in putting that all together. I hope that happens.
I hope it happens quickly in my lifetime.
Yes.
They're like, these are things that, you know, we were just talking with somebody a little bit earlier, and they had some lived experiences themselves with themselves. And one of the things that they said is that this has to change. These changes have to come about. We have to find some way for there to be a strong voice to be able to help people, because they need a strong voice at this point in time. It's gone on for too long. We've just looked the other way, you know?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that.
So I'm going to keep you on just for a few minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. Let's see.
Sure.
Uh,